I'm Greg Robbins. I work in Google's Seattle engineering office as a software engineer. In 1992, I was hired as an independent contractor at Apple Computer to write operating system code for an experimental hardware project. On that project, I met Ron Avitzur. He was also an independent contractor doing software for the project. Ron's here to tell the story of what we did after that project ended.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me apologize in advance. There will be no actual technical content in this tech talk. I'm turning 40 next week, and so I apologize if I become maudlin, but I'm taking this opportunity to embrace becoming an old codger by reminiscing publicly about the adventures of my youth. I started programming in the 70s, back when programs were stored on punched cards and the VT55 terminal was newfangled. I was a faculty brat at Lehigh University, so I had access to all sorts of toys as a youngin'. When I started college at Stanford in 1984, the Macintosh was brand new. And it was an interesting time to be on campus looking at computer use, because when I started college, in 1984, there were Macs on campus. I had one, and Stanford was an early adopter. But largely, nearly all the students still used typewriters. And the interesting thing to see was that the original Macintosh, along with MacWrite 1.0, was so amazingly easy to use and easy to learn that you could take someone, and I did this many times, someone who had never touched a computer before, was completely non-technical, sit them down in front of the original Mac, and in 5 minutes of instruction with MacWrite, they would learn everything they need to know, and it would be blindingly obvious to them immediately that they could get the paper written that they had to have written that night. They could get the job done quicker using the computer, even after they took into account the learning curve. And so in terms of ease of use and ease of learning, that's a very strong statement, that you could take someone that's a complete novice, and it's just obvious to them that, yes, this tool does the job better, even with the time it takes me to learn it. I was studying physics at the time, so most of my time was spent doing mathematical problem sets, which involved staying up late at night, writing out 10 or 20 pages of algebra for each one. And it was ironic that I was watching essentially the last years of the typewriter go away, as word processing was just obviously the right way to do things. And at the same time, the computer was far more useful to my colleagues writing English papers than to me doing math. For the math I was doing, the computers were just not at all useful. It wasn't that the math was difficult. I had access to systems. I was familiar with the state-of-the-art in computer algebra at the time, which was maxima and reduce. And mathematically, they could do any of the sorts of things we were doing in our problem sets, but the time it took to formulate your problem in their command line interface, struggle with their syntax, and then interpret the result in a way that's presentable as a document was far more time than it took to just do everything out longhand with pencil and paper. And fundamentally, that's a user interface problem. So I took some time off from school to develop software to essentially do for mathematical problem sets what word processors do for people just writing prose. This became a Macintosh product around 1987 called Milo that was billed as a math processor for students doing problem sets. It integrated text equations and graphics in a document. The equations were WYSIWYG. They appeared in the standard textbook notation as you entered them, and you could manipulate them doing the sorts of algebra and calculus things that students would be doing as undergraduates. While the original product, Milo, wasn't a commercial success, it was influential on a number of other products. And the source code from it I licensed out to a number of other companies that was later embedded in other products. Its biggest limitation, just as a tool for students, was that the word processing in it was extremely minimalist. It was too weak even to do the simple things that students needed. So I went out looking for companies essentially embed the Milo software in their word processor, and ended up at Frame Technology. They were looking for a mathematical typesetting system for FrameMaker 2.0. And I worked there for a while, embedding the mathematical typesetting from Milo into FrameMaker. All of the computation that went into it, all of the computer algebra system, essentially came along for free, and they left it in just to give the sales folks more buttons to push for to make demos. They didn't quite realize what they had until it had been shipping for a while, and someone at an Arizona nuclear plant sent in a bug report of the form. It evaluates this particular integral incorrectly, but at that point they were committed. So FrameMaker is a beautiful system. It's still shipping today, and FrameMath is still derivative from the original work I did on Milo. At the time I was proud to be responsible for the only page layout and word processing program that would evaluate derivatives symbolically and multiply matrices and have serious mathematical underpinning. But it still wasn't ideal for students, and again, it was fundamentally a question of the user interface. There are a number of problems with user interface in mathematics. The most fundamental one is that mathematical notation evolved for use with pencil and paper. It involves a much larger character set than you typically find on a keyboard, and it's intrinsically two-dimensional. So after working at Frame for a while, I went off on my own and did what many others have done. I wrote a handwriting recognition system that could handle a large character set for mathematical symbols and Greek letters, and also parse the two-dimensional structure of the mathematics as you write it on a tablet. I took a version of Milo which embedded the handwriting recognition so that you could essentially write on a tablet as if it were a piece of paper, equations and text and scribbles, and be able to manipulate the equations, and then started taking that to hardware companies. Look at the time when Go and Momenta and pen computing were very popular, looking for a hardware platform that would be appropriate. And this is how I ended up at Apple. I had what was an impressive demo of pen computing, but still was a long way from a useful product and needed a hardware platform that was suitable for it. And this is where I met Greg. So after a year working on a secret hardware project at Apple, and I won't go into any details on that, ultimately the project was canceled. And while on the one hand the time working at Apple was it was very educational, working in system software, and also very educational being part of a large company. When the project was canceled, it was, in one sense, a relief because the hardware project we were a part of was having problems. But in another sense, it was extremely frustrating that essentially a year of work was completely wasted. So at this point, I decided that I wanted to stay and finish it so that it wasn't a waste. As the hardware project was winding down, one fellow would visit my office almost daily and tell me that the PowerPC group, which was down the hall, was building some exciting hardware, and I really had to meet them. But while working on this other project, I was too busy. So after the original project was canceled, I went and visited the folks at PowerPC who were interested in the work I was doing, but were unable, they were too busy with their own work to be able to hire me. So this one fellow brought another friend of his into my office after the project was canceled and just camped out there for the night. They decided that they were going to port our software, the software I had been working on, to the PowerPC hardware, and they spent till the wee hours of the morning going through 50,000 lines and getting it to run as a PowerPC native application. At the time, the only way to build on PowerPC was to cross-compile from an IBM RS6000 workstation. So it was a difficult piece of porting in that the PowerPC wasn't shipping yet, the software tools for it weren't ready yet, and there wasn't a lot of expertise in how to build applications for it. But after many hours, we got it to compile and link, and then took it down to the next building where one of them knew where there was one of the rare PowerPC prototypes. The first time we launched it, the monitor attached to the prototype caught on fire and started smoking. I could not make this up. The fellow just shrugged and unplugged the monitor and carried it out onto the balcony to avoid setting off the smoke detectors. Plugged in another monitor and tried again. And we were very impressed. On the PowerPC machine, it was running 50 times faster than it had been on the development machine I had been working on before. Things that had previously been taking 5 seconds a frame were suddenly animating at 10 frames a second. It was a qualitative difference in what you could do with the machine, a qualitative difference in the behavior. They just looked at it and said, this doesn't suck, which at Apple at the time was high praise. Typically, people in system software would struggle to make small improvements, and if they were able to improve something a little, they would praise it by saying, that sucks less. So at this point, we had an impressive demo. We had a native PowerPC application, almost the only one in existence, because everyone in Apple that's working on the PowerPC at this time, and this is in August of '93, is completely focused on just getting the hardware to run, getting everything to run correctly under emulation, and no one has spare time to spend working on native applications because all the focus is on compatibility. No one outside the company expects Apple to succeed. It's been announced publicly as part of the Apple, IBM, Motorola alliance that Apple is switching to PowerPC, but no large company had made such a transition successfully yet, and the expectation was that the first release of these machines would be a disaster because of compatibility problems. So with all of the internal engineering cycles being focused on compatibility, this was one of the very few native applications. Unfortunately, after the last year of struggling with a failing project, I was completely burnt out. We had been working long hours and killing ourselves for months trying to keep this project from being canceled, long past the point where it was obvious to everyone on the outside that it was doomed. And I was in no shape to do the work it needed to take this demo and turn it into something real. So at this point, I called Greg, who was now in a different division of the company, and explained that you've got to come over and see this. I'd really like to ship it, but there's an enormous amount of work to do, and there's no way I can do it alone. Greg, fortunately, was just finishing up a contract in his division at the time. So he talked to his manager and said that he would start reporting to me. And she didn't ask who I was, and she let him keep the office and the badge. And my old manager hadn't turned off my badge. So we both still had access to the building, and we both still had our offices, but he told people that he was reporting to me, and I told people that I was reporting to him. That left no managers in the loop, so there were no meetings, and we could be really productive. It was an amazing change. I went from months upon months of what seemed like a death march of struggling to do little things and being completely unable to accomplish anything just because of the friction in the process, to suddenly having no meetings and being able to program 12 hours a day, being able to decide things by going in and chatting for 30 seconds or 5 minutes and just asking what's the right thing to do. Okay, let's go do it. And suddenly we were making a huge amount of progress. It was a great relief. And Greg was starting fresh. I was burnt out, but Greg wanted this to succeed, and he was putting an enormous amount of effort into just being perfectionist about every detail. When we started, I figured, I think there's about a month's worth of work to actually take this and polish it into a finished product. Greg probably had a more realistic idea of what that meant at the time. So while this was going on, I had no official relationship with Apple. I had been a contractor, but the contract ended when that project was canceled. I tried to be completely honest with everyone when this came up. People would sometimes ask me, do you work here? And I'd tell them no. And then they'd assume, oh, that means you're a contractor. And I'd say, well, actually, no. And then they'd ask, but then who's paying you? And I'd say, no one. And then they'd ask, but how do you live? And I'd explain, I live simply. And then they'd get a really strange look at their face and say, what are you doing here? At that point, I'd pull them into my office and give them a demo, and the demo was very flashy. And I'd explain, well, I had been a contractor, but the project was canceled some time back, and I decided to stay and finish it anyway. And all the engineers that I explained this to were extremely sympathetic. At this point in Apple's history, just about everyone had been through one, if not 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 canceled projects. It was very, very hard to get things to ship back then. There were lots of ways projects failed, and a lot more projects got started than finished. So after seeing what I was doing, they were sympathetic, and as often as not asked if there was any way they could help. There had been something of a history of skunkworks projects. There had been many times in the past where engineers took their canceled projects and worked on it after hours on their own time, trying to revive it, and sometimes were successful. There was one project at the time, appropriately enough, codenamed Spectre, which had been canceled and revived 5 times at the time I was there. I don't know if it's shipped since then. Mostly because we didn't report to anyone. We weren't anyone's responsibility. We were just under the radar. No one worried about us because everyone was focused about worrying about what they were responsible for. And we had both been working there for over a year, so we were familiar faces, and it was assumed we belonged. And everyone assumed someone knew what we were up to and was responsible for us. And we just relied on the power of corporate apathy. We just kept showing up because it was so far outside people's expectations that it just didn't occur to anyone what was going on. But I did slip up at one point. Someone from facilities visited me in my office one day and explained, we're moving people into these offices because on my map of the floor, these offices are empty, so your manager is going to have to find you new space. And that sort of thing happened all the time. Engineers changed from one group to the other and didn't feel like schlepping all their stuff, so they stayed in their old office until someone else needed the space, and she just figured that my new manager would find me space. But I had been so used to telling the story, just as I'm telling you here now, I told her the truth. She was not amused. She called security and had them cancel our badges and told us in no uncertain terms that we had to leave. Now, right about this time, Apple went through the great layoffs of 1993, where they laid off about 10 or 15% of their global workforce. During the layoffs, we were safe because we weren't on the books. We didn't officially exist. After the layoffs, there were plenty of empty offices. So we moved our stuff, and I made an effort to avoid this one facilities person who actually knew we didn't belong there. And our badges no longer worked, but we had them physically, so we just wore them as decoys and made sure they didn't get anywhere near a door detector. And I'd show up in the morning, and I'd park my car and look around the parking lot for a familiar face, and then time my walk to the door to arrive right behind them. They'd open the door for me and say, "Good morning, Ron." I'd say good morning and trail in after them. Or if Greg got there first, I'd call Greg, and he'd let me in, or vice versa. And we were just being so productive. We started out working 12 hours a day, and it just went up from there because we were getting a lot done. That at this point, the thought of stopping it for a trivial reason like not having building access just didn't occur to us. Physically, we couldn't do what we were doing outside the building because the only way to compile on PowerPC required an RS-6000 workstation with custom software that didn't exist outside of Apple. And there were no developer notes or developer support because no one was building for PowerPC. So we really needed access to engineers to even know what to do things or be able to do things. And there were no prototypes to be had outside the company. We realized what we were doing was ludicrous. At one point, Greg and I just stopped and looked at each other and said, okay, let me get this straight. We're literally sneaking into the building, evading security to do volunteer work for an $8 billion corporation. At least this is certainly going to have good storytelling value. In Spinal Tap idiom, this one goes to 11. Now, we were making great progress programming, but the more we did, the more we realized that there was an enormous amount to do, and we couldn't do it alone. It wasn't just a question of the programming. There was everything else that goes into making software. It takes a team effort, and there were lots of things we just didn't have the skills for. At one point, I went out and just hired out of pocket a graphics designer, a visual design expert that had previously been laid off from Apple, and just hired her onto my project. She didn't know what my situation was, and I thought it was safer for her not to know, just for her own benefit. So I invited her in and showed her what we were doing, and she did some designs for us that eventually shipped. Documentation was a problem. I hired some people to help with the documentation. Our biggest problem was QA. Fundamentally, you can't do your own QA. It's a question of seeing your own blind spots, and it's expensive to do it well. And that was something we couldn't afford and needed people to do. Fortunately, at this point, I always kept my office doors open, and people liked what we were doing, so they'd come by daily to see our progress, report bugs. I'd fix them and invite them back in the next day to test their fix and show them what they'd done. And then they got excited that they were having some effect. And so a lot of people were going through my office on a regular basis to see what the latest changes were. And we had become something of an underground cause celeb. People would whisper about us, like, have you heard the story of these two guys? You've got to see what they're doing. It's really cool. And I let it be known that we really needed help because we needed people to start testing this. So at one point, these two guys come down from upstairs. They're doing QA on the PowerPC system software, and they tell me they're really bored because they spent a long time developing automated test tools, and now they're at the point where they push the button and the test tools start in the morning, and they see which APIs break and send out the email, but basically it's an automated process, and they heard we needed some help. They told us that they had stuff they were supposed to officially be doing, but it was boring, so they wanted to help us out, but I shouldn't let people know. So I gave them copies of the software, and they started reporting bugs. They started reporting lots of bugs. It was great. One of them had a PhD in mathematics. One of them had done shareware math software before. They were amazing. I could not have found more qualified people had I looked. While this is going on, the various engineers that are helping us out want to tell their managers. They think it's cool, it demos well. They think, look, of course they're going to love what you're doing. You have to show it to them. But I've been putting them off for weeks because it's one thing for engineers to think something is cool, and it's another thing to ship something to millions of customers. And I know that difference. So the default assumption when an engineer says, look, I've been working on my own time and I've developed this cool thing, the default assumption is that there's a very high burden of proof that what you've done actually is worth shipping. And when we were at a stage where the software would still crash, I didn't want to show it to anyone in management, because if they see something that crashes, they're just going to shrug and say, yeah, that's cool, okay, I don't have time to think about this. And so for a long time, I was only showing it to engineers and telling them, wait a while, it has to be perfect before you show it to your management. And the big thing that was missing was everything we were doing was in 2D. This was at a time when there were no GPUs and 3D hardware was the province of SGI. So we needed to be able to render 3D graphics in software, and it's not an entirely trivial thing to do. This was before there was a lot of open source to choose from, and it looked like something that would take me at least a month to do that I didn't have. I talked to a friend of mine who's at Google now, who was an expert in these matters. He took a weekend off from his startup company and wrote us a 3D software renderer that was just amazing. He did in 2 days what would have taken me weeks or a month, and it worked perfectly the first time with bug-free. Once we got that integrated in, things were stable enough and impressive enough that I was ready to seriously start thinking about how we could ship this. And the biggest problem that faced us was a question of how to get something to ship, because I knew lots of projects that had been canceled, lots of official funded projects on the books that had been canceled. There were a lot of people in the company that have the power to stop things for one reason or another, but it's very difficult to actually get through all the landmines and convince folks that this really deserves to be on the machines and to ship. So at one point, a fellow from the hardware team came to my office early in the morning, I think at 2 a.m. one night, and explained to me how Apple worked physically. He said, Apple is a hardware company. There's a factory out in Cork, Ireland, that produces machines, and the production ramp is going to start on such and such a date. And the night before the factory starts boxing machines in the warehouse, I FedEx them what's called the Golden Master hard disk, and that gets cloned onto all the machines in the factory. And at this point in Apple's history, there was a huge attrition rate. The company wasn't treating engineers well. The future of the company was seriously in question. A lot of people were just leaving as is. And he told me, so if you get me the bits the night before the Golden Master gets FedEx to Cork, they can appear on the GM disk and they will be boxed in 30,000 units in the factory before anyone knows they're there. In a very real and pragmatic sense, he said, I decide what does and does not ship. So this conversation, needless to say, warmed my heart, because that was a problem that I was completely flummoxed on. I just tried not to think about it because it was too depressing. And it was obvious, if he pulled a stunt like that, he would lose his job or worse. And as soon as anyone realized it was there, the legal exposure, they would pull it and kill it. So it wasn't a path we wanted to take, but it was really very reassuring that the offer was made. Now, in retrospect, I don't even know if he was serious, but this is what he told me, and it let us move forward with more confidence. Now, we didn't want him to lose his job, and we thought that it was our responsibility to at least do the due diligence and make a good faith effort to go through proper channels. So when we had the 3D and when I was no longer aware of any crashing bugs and it had been in the tester's hands for long enough, I told all the engineers that had been supporting us, okay, it's time, you can go tell your managers to come meet me. Oh, and even before this was a time when we had access to amazing resources that we couldn't have had we officially existed. This was a time when I knew folks at IBM that were complaining. IBM was just starting their fab runs on the original 601 PowerPC chip, and it wasn't fully debugged yet. People at IBM couldn't get the chips because although they were going to be using it in their workstations, Apple would ship a million PowerPCs the first year, which is 10 or 100 times more than IBM would ship. So all the initial chip runs went to Apple for testing. And of the I think maybe 200 PowerPC chips that were in existence at all, most of them were in hardware being tested. There was a very small number of coveted machines that the system software folks who needed it to test to ship on the initial release had, and no one else in the company could get them. I would occasionally have lunch with people that were fairly high up in projects not related to PowerPC who would complain that, yeah, I'm on the waiting list and I won't get a machine for 6 months. But at this time, Greg and I actually had some. An engineer from the hardware group came to my office at midnight one day and brought a machine in and said, now this looks like an ordinary 68K Macintosh, so don't let anyone take the lid off. Officially, this machine doesn't exist. If anyone asks, I don't know you. And whatever you do, it must not leave the building. So we had a PowerPC to work on at this point. Still, we're sneaking into the building, and still no managers know about us, but the project's far enough along that we can give it to people, it doesn't crash, it looks impressive, and so I tell everyone, okay, bring your managers in, we'll make a good faith effort to actually convince them that this needs to ship. And so they all went to their managers in various different groups and said, there's these two guys you have to meet. We can't explain why, just really it's worth your time. Be at this office at 2 in the afternoon, and it'll be worth it, trust us. So the afternoon comes around, and these 15 people are packed into my office that I haven't met, introductions all around. And I give them the demo that I've been giving to all the engineers that have been coming through. And I explain how this is really useful in a math classroom, that it's something that high school teachers can use essentially as an animated blackboard to explain abstract concepts visually. And for Apple, it's also a demonstration that the PowerPC fundamentally changes the rules, because previously, software designers would design their software around the limitations of an 8 megahertz 68K machine, the bottom of the line, because they wanted to sell to the most computers possible, to the largest installed base. And so they had to assume that they were writing their software for people with the slowest machines. And that affects a lot of user interface design decisions. And what the PowerPC let Apple do is it let Apple say, this is the new lowest common denominator. When you're designing software, think of this as the new slowest machine. And it's 20,000 times faster than the original Macintosh from 10 years previously. And that lets people, as a software designer, think of things very differently. Things that had previously been batch-oriented can become interactive. Things that previously used to take a long time, you could do in an interactive way, which lets you simplify the interface in a lot of ways that now, 12 years later, have become natural, we take for granted, but at the time were new. So I gave a demonstration to all the managers, mostly focusing on the user interface implications, that this is a demonstration for developers on how they can improve their user interface using the speed of the machine to do things in a new way. And the managers all looked at this and said, that's awesome. That's the story we've been telling people all along, but because we haven't had any native apps, because we've been so focused on compatibility, we've had to talk about it. We haven't been able to show them, but this really illustrates what we've been trying to do. And no one else at Apple was working on educational math software, so this didn't step on any toes. The managers just looked at this and said, That's great. Why has it been such a secret? Who's your manager? Why didn't they tell us about this before? So at this point, I tell them the story, much as I'm telling you here now up to this point, and I explain, no, the project was canceled several months ago. This badge was canceled. If I get it anywhere near a door, security will appear immediately and escort me outside. And they laugh until they realize I'm serious, and then they get quiet and think about it for a bit. And then they just look at me and say, okay, we really want to ship this. We'll figure out a way to do it. Whatever you do, don't repeat this story. So now we're adopted by the people in charge of the PowerPC project on whom the company's future depends, which in some sense makes us official, but we're still sneaking into the building. So at this point, things get really weird because they're assigning people to work on it. And I'm in the middle of this whirlwind of activity with all of these employees actually assigned to do various things on it in this project that I'm effectively managing while I'm sneaking into the building. So the first thing they do, because it's really easy to do an impressive demo that is just the smoke and mirrors. So the very first thing they do, naturally, is they have to get some due diligence. They have to get someone to test this and see whether it's real, whether it's worth shipping, or whether it's just smoke and mirrors in a demo. So the head of QA on the PowerPC software is the first person to take me aside and says, I've got these two guys working upstairs. They already have a full-time schedule. They're really overworked, but I want to introduce you just to see whether they can squeeze some extra time into doing some QA on your project, because we need to test this. And I smile, and he introduces us, and we shake hands, and I meet my testing team. I didn't tell him that they'd been working on it for a few weeks now. So we have official QA now. The other big thing we need is usability testing, because we want this to be actually useful in the schools. It's going to go out on every machine, and it's just going to be there in the classrooms. And the big question for us is this something that teachers can use? And it's very different to design software for engineers than it is to design software that's useful in the classroom. In a classroom situation, teachers have no attention to spare. Any time spent playing with the software when it doesn't work is taken away from the curriculum. It's taken away from the students. Anytime something crashes, it's just a waste of time for everyone. So Apple assigned people from their HI department to do a formal usability study. They assigned people from QA to do testing. They assigned a whole lot of people to do localizations. It was, I think, translated into about 15 languages. Meanwhile, we're sneaking into the building. Apparently, the people who run the PowerPC project, despite the future of the company depending on it, can't get us badges, because you can't have a badge without a signed purchase order. You can't get a purchase order without a signed contract. And there's no way they could explain our situation to legal without us being escorted out immediately. So at one point while all this is going on, this one fellow, Tim, sees Greg waiting in front of the building looking for someone to let him in, and just accosts Greg, and says, I'm sick and tired of you guys loitering in front of the building every day. I'm going to get you badges. So he comes to my office and tells us he's going to get us badges. I try to explain that, no, they've tried. They couldn't. We can't get badges without a PO. We can't get a PO without a contract. And he just drags me down to his office and sits on the phone with the badge folks. And he goes around with them in circles for 20 minutes. And I'm just listening to his side of the conversation, but I'm sure that it's going the same way it always has, and he'll fail. They say, if they're employees, they get their badges after they go through the employee orientation. And he explains, they're not employees, we have no intention of hiring them. And they say, well, if they're contractors, to get the badge, you need to get the signed contract. And then he stops and says, no, they're not contractors. We're not actually paying them. And then he says, well, okay, if they're employees, and they just go around in a circle. They're not contractors, they're not employees, we're not paying them. Yes, they need badges. But he wore them down. Eventually they said, okay, you take the badge form where it says contractors, you cross that out and you write in vendor. And where it says contract number, you write in the magic words, no dollar contract. He got us badges the next day. It amazed everyone. It amazed the people running the project. Apparently, Apple, as most companies, has a strict caste system. You can tell the distance by the background color on people's badges, where they are relative to you in the caste hierarchy. The white badges are employees, they're very hard to fire, and they get lots of perks. I think it was the yellow badges were summer interns, they're treated as employees, but they're really just college students. And the green badges are contractors, and because of various IRS law rules, you can't give them any perks and have to treat them very shabbily. But we had orange badges, and no one had seen these before. But what amazed me is they exactly described us. As vendors, what it meant is that we didn't work for Apple, they didn't pay us, but my company has us on loan to Apple to work on site. So we were the few, the proud, the vendors. The people that watered the plants, worked in the cafeteria, and fixed the Xerox machine are the vendors. They don't actually work here, but we get building access. So we didn't have to sneak in anymore. That was good. Usability testing was a very eye-opening experience for me. I had been working on various forms of this software for 10 years, entirely focused on the usability. We were designing it entirely in the mind of this is going to go into classrooms without any training, with very little documentation, with no support, and we wanted to be useful to teachers and students. And we spent a long time agonizing over small details in the user interface, thinking what would make it simplest, easiest to learn, easiest to use, most useful in a classroom situation. And Apple did a fabulous job on the usability testing. They went out and they got a group of teachers. And in the first day of the testing, the teachers all sat around in groups of 2. They were given the software and said to make problems for the students to work during the rest of the week. Because they were working in groups of 2, they would talk aloud through everything. And the person running the test just sat them at the software and said, this is going to go on machines in the classroom. It's not coming with anything, so we want to see what you can do with it to try and set some problems for your students. And then he just sat with folded hands for the next 2 hours, watching them not saying anything while they tried to use it, and while I was behind a 2-way mirror pounding on the glass. It's a very eye-opening experience. I think anyone who designs your interface, all engineers should be forced to go through this, watching real users actually try to use their software. The questions we agonized over were so far beyond the actual issues that stopped them several steps before they got there. And the sorts of things that they had trouble with were things that never even occurred to us could be a problem. And watching that 8 hours a day for 5 days as group after group went in and ran into problems, it forced us both to go back and rethink a lot of things from scratch, and enormously improved the interface and enormously improved how it was useful in the classroom. So being publicly known in the company helped in a lot of ways with all of the resources that we suddenly had at our disposal. The usability testing was amazing. It also made things more complicated because suddenly being public, the software was being demoed to outside companies as well. And as soon as that happened, two different groups called in, one of them claiming that the software infringed upon his patent, causing a fire drill because Apple has deep pockets and they don't want to ship something that gives them any exposure. It took me a while to demonstrate that the patent that he was referring to actually referred to me as the prior art, so they really didn't have to worry about this case. And another company that did mathematical software simply called and said, you shouldn't ship this, just because they want to be the only people that are known to ship mathematical software. And Apple very politely declined, which impressed me because a week before we were still sneaking into the building, and the next week Apple is rising to our defense. So at this point, we're working long hours, 14, 16 hours a day. It's kind of a blur. We'd just show up, run through the tests, check out the bugs, fix things. We were very fortunate in one respect. When we started the project, the original ship date for the PowerPC hardware was much sooner. And because they were because they had to ramp up the factory, the drop-dead date for the software to start the production was several months before the actual release date. And so when we started, we thought we actually only had a little more than 6 weeks or 8 weeks to finish the entire project before it had to go to the Golden Master Disk. And it was a very tight schedule. We designed everything around that schedule because they weren't going to delay the hardware for us. We weren't on any official plans. If we were late, they just wouldn't ship it. That was simple, and no one else would care. And so we on the other hand, because no one was expecting the software, there was no pressure on features. There was no design document. There was no one saying it has to do this, this, and this. So we just cut down the feature sets to what we basically already had and to what we knew we could ship reliably, and then focused entirely on usability and on making the software stable. We wanted to make sure that something shipping on millions of machines would never crash. And then the hardware schedule slipped 3 months for reasons that had nothing to do with us, obviously. And so at this point, we have the code essentially frozen, the feature set completely frozen, and we have an extra 3 months during which we did nothing but testing and a line-by-line code review. It was a unique opportunity. It was more testing than I'd ever had on any project before or since. Because we were the only native PowerPC application, everyone who had a prototype, and as time went on, this was more and more people, immediately went to our software to play with because it was the most interesting thing to play with. Other than our software and one or two other tiny demos, it wasn't obvious outside the box that this was nothing but a typical Macintosh. Compatibility was really good, but running things under emulation, they ran about as fast as they used to on the last generation of machines. It was only when you ran a native application that suddenly it was doing things you could not possibly do on the previous generation machines, and it was obvious that under the hood, this was something completely different. And so for many months, as the only native application, everyone who had the hardware was playing with our software and coming by my office and saying, this doesn't work, this is confusing, it crashed here. And so for many months, we added no features, we did a line-by-line code review, and we did nothing but testing and no code changes that weren't bug fixes. As a result, it was the most stable application I have ever shipped before or since. And I like to brag that we reached what both Apple and power computing. Apple, for many years after that point, when people would bring their hardware in complaining of random crashes, one of the things they would recommend and one of the first things they would do when they had a piece of hardware is they would run the self-running demo that the graphing calculator shipped and let it run overnight. And if the demo crashed, they would classify that as a hardware failure. I like to think of that as the theoretical limit of software stability. Now, to be fair, later versions of the software beyond 1.0 were not that crash-proof. But that original version, I'm very proud of in that respect. So to make a long story short, eventually, yes, they shipped it. It's still shipping in the macOS 9 ghetto to this day. But it's been shipping now for 12 years and has been on 20 or 30 or 40 million machines. It's in use in high school classrooms around the world. Only recently, with Tiger, did they replace it with a native program called Grapher that's completely unrelated to this. But it's still shipping as part of the macOS 9 partition if you install Classic. Now, as the project was ending, I was able to I hired a few people out of pocket and was able to pay them, but Greg had been working 12, 14, 16-hour days for 6 months now as a favor to me on something that I initially said, oh, it'll take about a month. And there's no way he could explain to his parents what he'd been doing. They don't use computers, they're not technical. So one day I was looking at the New York Times and I saw the picture of a friend of mine on the business section, and I knew the guy that the article was about, so I showed it to Greg and said, hey, I know this fellow. How would you like to have your picture in the New York Times so your parents know what you've been up to? And he looked at me and made the only possible response. He said, yeah, right. So I made a bet on the spot for dinner at this really nice restaurant. And I was expecting, to be honest, I was expecting to lose the bet. But I knew the fellow that had written this other article, and I called him up and said, I've been working on this cool software, I'd like to show it to you. And now I don't work for Apple, and I can't represent Apple. But the software is something I've been working on for 10 years, and it's my software. So I can talk about the software, I can talk about user interface. And I invited him over, and I gave him the same spiel I was giving other people. I didn't talk about Apple at all, except to say that we developed this new software to run on new, faster machines. And the Apple, IBM, Motorola alliance was public, so he knew about that. And he was writing an article principally about the alliance between Apple, IBM, and Motorola, but they're big companies, and just to put a friendly face, a human face on, he made an article he talked a little about the new generation of software and had a photo of the three of us who had principally wrote the software on the front time of the New York Business section. So Greg's parents could see what he had been up to. Now, I called someone I knew in Apple's public relations department and said, I'm giving an interview to the Times. Would you like to send someone over to represent Apple? And then they gave me the standard response, engineers are not allowed to talk with the press. But I didn't work there, so that was the next time I saw that PR person, she was absolutely livid, presumably because there was really nothing she could do about it. We couldn't be fired. But it was good press for Apple, and our parents were pleased. That's basically the story. I'm still working on the software. This is last year's version. I'm working on the next release that will be out in 6 months or so. I've been working on it now for 20 years. Every day is an exercise in software archaeology.
Where can we get it?
Email either me or Greg. Oh, and the website, okay, the official plug. The website is www.pacifict.com, or just Google graphing calculator.
So how did you guys pay for your apartments and stuff like that for 6 weeks, months?
Well, we were working 12, 14, 16 hours a day, so our expenses were very low. And I live simply, and Apple, we were both contractors at Apple prior to this. Apple paid very well as contractors. In some sense, I think my attitude was, Apple paid me very well as a contractor for things that didn't ship. I felt duty-bound to actually finish it and ship it.
Do you retroactively pay at all or compensate in any way once it did ship? And also, the jobs ever comment on it?
All of this occurred after Steve Jobs had left and before he returned, so it was not during his tenure. Haven't heard anything from him about it. We wanted the software to keep shipping. We didn't want Apple to have any reason to have to pull it. So yes, after all of the events of the story, everything was made retroactively kosher. The software was licensed to Apple so that they could ship it comfortably for as long as they liked.
Could you repeat the questions for the video?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, were we eventually paid, and did Steve Jobs ever comment on it? We did eventually license it to Apple for a nominal fee, but no, there's never any comment from Steve.
So how long did you go between paychecks?
The question was, so how long did I go between paychecks? I don't actually recall. Because I'd been working for a contractor my entire career, it was typical for me to go 2 or 3 years between paychecks. So it really was, it wasn't out of the ordinary in my case. I often worked for a company, worked on my own for several years, and then licensed the work, and so this felt quite natural.
It's not a question, but when I first got the Power PC, I was delighted with the hardware, and graphic calculator was just the coolest thing on the system. And it's like, I absolutely love the software then. It's just fantastic hearing the story now.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing it.
Our pleasure. Waldemar.
What do you do now?
Oh, what do I do now?
Do you still work on this full time?
I'm still working on what is essentially the first C program I started writing in 1985. Still working on it full time. You know what software is like. It's still not done. And teachers have been using it in this form for over 12 years now. I have a very long collected list of requests that they have. I'm continuing to run down the feature list, continuing to find ways to improve it without making the interface more complex. It's a common tension. It's a constant tension between keeping the interface simple, easy to use, and easy to learn, while also being able to do more interesting and more powerful things. The fundamental design that I'm trying to reach is one where if you open up a typical textbook for some subject, you'll often see an equation in a picture, and I want to be able to type that equation as you see it in the textbook and generate an appropriate picture as a visualization for that. And that's a very broad space of problem.
So you made this 10 years ago, or 12 years ago. Since then, computers have advanced a lot. this was the application that basically illustrated how powerful PowerPC was. And has it changed a lot in the past 12 years? Have you taken advantage of the many generations of hardware improvements that have come since then?
The question is that the original graphing calculator 1.0 was now 12 years ago, and hardware has improved enormously in the last 12 years, just as it did in the 10 years between the original Macintosh and the PowerPC. And have you taken advantages of the improvements in the hardware since then? Absolutely. That's part of why I'm continuing to work on it. Each new speed bump in available hardware enables new kinds of visualization. And I'm absolutely in love with the modern generation of GPUs. You often have far more horsepower sitting on your graphics card, which is useful in a completely general mathematical way as a general SIMD computer, single instruction, multiple data, to do vast amount of computations quickly. One of the features I'm particularly proud of in this release from a couple of years ago, it will take equations you type and on the fly compile them into GPU programs, so that as well as using the CPU to render the 3D image, it will use the GPU to texture that based on the explicit equations that you've typed, compiling it on the fly for the GPU. With each new generation of hardware and each new improvement, it enables new kinds of visualization and enables new things in the classroom. So yes, absolutely.
I have a couple questions. The first one is, do you know why Apple stopped using this, using your program and making this issue?
The first question is, do I know why Apple stopped including our graphing calculator and acquired Grapher from a Swiss company? I can't speak on behalf of Apple. I could only speculate, and I wouldn't want to speculate. I expect part of the reason, certainly, it took us a very long time before our Mac OS X native release was available. It was actually available before they released Tiger, but that was at least part of the issue. I don't know fully what was going on back there. I'm actually very much out of touch with Apple. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors there.
My second question is, I'm just curious, what do you think the coolest feature of your graphic calculator is?
What do I think the coolest feature is? There's two parts to that. Fundamentally, I still think the coolest thing is the very boring thing, just the entirely useful and 2D work that you could do 20 years ago on old hardware, that you can just type sin x and immediately get a useful picture without a lot of dialogues, without a command line, without a lot of interface in your way, that you can just focus on the math and say what's going on here. And that's not flashy or whizzy and could have been done a long time ago and worked fine on 68K machines. But in terms of being actually useful in the classroom, what I think is most cool about it is that teachers can bring this up on an overhead and without preparation type something in, get a pretty picture, and then move on with the rest of the lecture having spent 30 seconds on it without having to focus all of their attention on, okay, I'm going to use the computer now, wait while I get things set up perfectly and let's hope it actually works. Being able to do something that a teacher can use in a hectic classroom with their attention split and without having time to prepare everything in advance, I think is, in my mind, that's what's most interesting. Now, as a technical person, though, the other side of things is, as a programmer, there's a lot going on under the hood to make things fast. Because the fundamental question is, given the fundamental question I keep looking at is, given whatever today's state of the art in computer hardware speed is, what can I do with that speed in a fluid way? What can I do with that speed that happens with immediate feedback? And that keeps changing. And most recently, all of the evolution of the GPU towards putting all of this amazing floating point compute power and parallel hardware on your video card lets you do really nice things. And so again, if anyone here would like to play with it, just email Greg or I.